Horsepower in the 1980s American market is very misunderstood. The beginning of the decade saw continued downsizing of both cars and engines in what was the end of the so-called malaise era. In 1980, a Mustang Cobra came with your choice of a 4.2-liter V8 or a 2.3-liter turbo four-cylinder, each with about 120 horsepower, although the V8 was slightly quicker with a 17-second quarter mile. The 1980 Camaro Z28 could be had with a 5.7-liter 350 cubic inch V8 with 190 horsepower and 280 pound-feet of torque, good for 16.5 seconds in the quarter mile, while the 4.9-liter turbo V8 Trans Am Firebird had 210 horsepower and 345 pound-feet of torque and could do it in 16 when it was running properly. A special edition Corvette's 350 had 230 horsepower and 275 pound-feet of torque and moved the underrated sports car to 60 in 7 seconds and the quarter mile in the mid-15s. Why underrated? Well, if we compare it to other sports cars of the period, the 205 horsepower Ferrari 308 GTS was 0.2 slower, which was that much quicker than the roughly 175 horsepower 911 SC, which in turn was that much quicker than the Aston Martin V8 Vantage, with 260 horsepower and 290 pound-feet of torque from its 5.3-liter. The V8 Porsche 928, with its 220 horsepower and 265 pound-feet of torque, was more evenly matched with the Z28, and with the 180 horsepower Datsun 280ZX Turbo, with a mid-8 second 0 to 60 and mid-16 second quarter mile. While cars like the 160 horsepower V8 Mercedes 450 SL and the 245 horsepower V12 Jaguar XJS ran in the mid-18s, or more than a second slower than the Dodge Murata CMX with 185 horsepower from its 5.9-liter 360 V8. By mid-decade, things had supposedly recovered, as seen by the escalating horsepower war in the pony car segment. By 1982, the Mustang had returned to the 302 or 5-liter V8, and by 1986, both it and the turbo four-cylinder SVO Mustang were up to 200 horsepower. This time the turbo was slightly quicker, with a 6.5 second 0 to 60 in the quarter mile in about 15. With its 1982 redesign, the Firebird would no longer have an advantage over the Camaro, and the top engine on both was a 305 cubic inch 5-liter V8 with 165 horsepower and 240 pound-feet of torque, good for 60 in the 8.5 second range and the quarter mile in the mid-16s. But by 1986, the IROC-Z and its Firebird counterpart brought back the 350 cubic inch 5.7-liter V8 with 220 horsepower and 320 pound-feet of torque, moving the car to 60 in 6.5 seconds and the quarter mile in the low 15s with an automatic. Dodge was competing in this segment with a Mitsubishi Starion, rebadged as the Conquest, and its 2.6-liter turbo, with just under 190 horsepower, was an even match for the IROC-Z. There was also a new Corvette for 1984, and at that time its 350 produced 205 horsepower, and performance was essentially the same as the previous model, at 7 seconds to 60 and 15.5 in the quarter mile. But the same couldn't be said for its competition. The Quattro valve version of the 308 was up to 230 horsepower and a mid-6 second 0 to 60 in the quarter mile under 15. The 911 3.2 was just under 230 horsepower and could hit 60 in less than 6 seconds in the quarter mile in the mid-14s. Even the Jaguar XJS HE had improved to over 260 horsepower and now hit 60 in less than 8 seconds in the quarter mile in the low 16s. But smaller sporty turbo coupes were becoming the trend. The Dodge Daytona Turbo Z with under 145 horsepower could also do the quarter mile in the low 16s. And the smaller and lighter Dodge Omni and Charger GLH were even quicker, and the GLH-S versions would have 175 horsepower, dropping times to the low 7-second range for 60 and the mid-15-second range in the quarter mile. The new Nissan 300ZX Turbo had an impressive, for the time, 225 horsepower for a low 6-second 0 to 60 and a quarter mile just under 15. But the car we forget was the ooh-ah car of the segment at the time, was the Porsche 944, which could pull 0 to 60 in less than 6 seconds and the quarter mile in the mid-14s from less than 220 horsepower. Of course, the 944 wasn't the only small German car gaining popularity at the time, and if I don't mention the E30 BMW, people are going to freak. But in the mid-80s, the top US version, the 325, was more about driving dynamics than outright performance, and only had about 120 horsepower, moving the car to 60 in just under 10 seconds, but could manage the quarter mile in just over 17. And to be honest, the Audi 5000S was getting more attention at the time. But even with 140 horsepower, it was much slower, hitting 60 at just under 11 seconds and the quarter mile in 18. In fact, a Chevy Celebrity Euro Sport with 125 horsepower was quicker by about half a second than the Audi, and a Chevy Citation X11 with 130 was noticeably quicker than the BMW, hitting 60 in the mid-8 second range and the quarter mile in the mid-16s. But the real sleeper of the period was Maserati's Biturbo, good for just over 190 horsepower and 0 to 60 in under 6 seconds and the quarter mile in the mid-14s. Which brings us to the so-called muscle car revival, something partially brought on by the NASCAR dominance of the new for 1983 Ford Thunderbird, a version of which could be had with the 5-liter V8 to start with, but with only 140 horsepower and 250 pound-feet of torque, it moved the car to 60 in just over 10 seconds and the quarter mile in just under 18. Not exactly muscle car territory. The 4-cylinder turbo coupe version gained distinct styling mid-decade, and by that point produced 155 horsepower and 190 pound-feet of torque for a more respectable 8.5 second 0 to 60 and mid-16 second quarter mile. And at the beginning was competing with more traditional coupes at GM, with a fairly generic 5-liter 305 cubic inch V8 with 150 horsepower, managing 0 to 60 in 10.5 seconds and the quarter mile in the high 17s. And the first response to Ford's Thunderbird was aero packages like the Monte Carlo Supersport and Grand Prix 2+2, still with the 305, but up to 180 horsepower and a mid-8 second 0 to 60 and mid-16 second quarter mile, or virtually the same as the X11. Then there was the Hurst Olds with the lightning rod triple shifter and a 307 cubic inch 5-liter V8, still with 180 horsepower, but with 20 more pound-feet of torque, and managed to shave off a tenth or two. But the cars that come to mind will always be the Regal Turbos and Buick's legendary 3.8-liter V6. The early T-Type had 175 horsepower and 275 pound-feet of torque, and managed to be marginally quicker than the V8 Oldsmobile, but was soon overshadowed by the Grand National with 245 horsepower and 355 pound-feet of torque, being even quicker. But in the last few years, there would be the GNX, capable of a 4.5 second 0 to 60 and the quarter mile in the high 12s, officially rated at less than 275 horsepower, but there are claims that it was actually well above 300 for obvious reasons. Of course, these GM cars were replaced in 1988 with rather plain front-wheel drive 2.8-liter V6 cars with 125 horsepower and a rather lackluster 0 to 60 of just over 11 seconds and the quarter mile of just over 18. Shortly thereafter, Ford introduced a new Thunderbird with a Super Coupe variant that used a supercharged 3.8-liter V6 with 190 horsepower and 240 pound-feet of torque for a mid-7 second 0 to 60 and a high 15 second quarter mile. Which brings us to the end of the decade. The turbo Mustangs were gone by this point, and the 5-liter had become fuel-injected for 225 horsepower and 300 pound-feet of torque, with the less sporty-looking LX versions being lighter and therefore quicker than the GT at less than 7 seconds to 60 and roughly 15 in the quarter mile. The Camaro Firebird 350, or 5.7-liter, was now up to 240 horsepower and 345 pound-feet of torque for a low 6 second 0 to 60 and a mid-14 second quarter mile. The Corvette 350 was up to 245 horsepower, but wasn't any quicker than the Camaro. But a 375 horsepower ZR1 version was just around the corner. Ferrari was now up to the 328 with 260 horsepower and was nearly half a second quicker than the Corvette. The 911 Turbo, with just over 280 horsepower, was another half a second quicker than the Ferrari. The Mercedes was up to a 560 SL, with just over 225 horsepower, and now in the low 7-second range to 60 and the high 15-second range in the quarter mile. And we finally got an M3 in 1988 with just over 190 horsepower, managing to do 60 in just over 6 seconds and the quarter mile in the high 14-second range. The turbo Toyota Supra would have 230 horsepower and would be challenging the 300ZX by decade's end with a 6.5-second 0 to 60 in the quarter mile in about 15. Dodge's Shelby Daytona was down to the mid 7-second range for 0 to 60 and the quarter mile under 16 seconds. And by that point, Ford had its own sports sedan in the Taurus SHO. With 220 horsepower, it could do 60 in under 7 seconds and the quarter mile in the low 15s. Overall, when it comes to American cars, the end of the 1980s didn't see any higher numbers than the end of the 1970s. Those numbers, however, were coming from smaller cars, often with smaller engines. And although the cars with performance intentions were often quicker, the cars in other segments often were not, but they were more economical. Most imports saw huge increases in power over this decade, putting them on equal standing with the American cars for power, which were now more in tune size-wise with the imports. The exception to all of this, of course, being the high-end exotics. In Europe in 1980, a 512 Berlinetta Boxer was rated at 335 horsepower for a low 5-second 0 to 60 and mid 13-second quarter mile. In 1989, a U.S. spec Testarossa was rated at 380 horsepower for virtually identical performance. The Countach had around 350 to 370 horsepower at the start of the decade, and by the end of the decade in U.S. trim would be up to 420 and could do 60 in less than 5 seconds and the quarter mile in less than 13. And it had easily 30 more horsepower in European trim. But if we're looking at cars that you couldn't get, the Porsche 959 had 510 horsepower, turning all four wheels to 60 in 3.5 seconds, and the quarter mile in the mid-11s. But these cars are called exotics for a reason. Going forward, the entire market would change. Power would go up, but performance cars would price themselves right out of their market segment, and often right out of existence. And although high-end exotics would continue to be the top horsepower providers, luxury cars would once again move above the more affordable performance cars. Is that something worth looking at? Perhaps another time. But for now, thanks for watching. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and comment below.